I'm Conor, Senior Researcher at the Intergenerational Foundation. We're a research charity advocating on behalf of younger and future generations in the UK. We work on the big policy challenges shaping the lives of young people, from housing and taxation to student finance and the labour market. Our work focuses on exposing intergenerational unfairness and trying to advocate for practical, evidence-based reforms. In this new podcast series, we'll be speaking to some of the UK's leading experts on the issues that matter most to younger and future generations. My guest today is Emma Warren, a writer and cultural documentarian and author of Up the Youth Club, Illuminating a Hidden History. Emma has written extensively about grassroots culture and music, including in Make Some Space and Dance Your Way Home. And her latest book tells the hidden history of youth clubs across the UK and asks what happens when those spaces disappear. Here at IF, we spend a lot of time thinking about the institutions that support younger people. We often talk about schools and universities, housing and the labour market, but youth clubs are another important part of that story. They gave generations of younger people somewhere to go, something to do, adults they could trust, and spaces to become themselves. Emma, thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So you've spent a lot of your career writing about the spaces and places where people meet and gather. So I think perhaps the best place to start is with how you first came to the topic of youth clubs in particular, and why you felt that there needed to be a history or story of youth clubs in the UK.
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that you're quite right. My work is about cultural spaces where people gather, often on a very local, grassroots street level, and that those places are inherently valuable. And I think there's a misconception about youth clubs that they sit in a particular part of the world, which is like some kind of dusty subsector of charity. But I'm saying, well, no, actually, they're kind of engines of culture. They're culture machines. But the other thing to say at this point is that I consider all these things to be rooms in the same house. The youth club, the street corner, the grassroots music venue, the village hall, the village green, the park. Public space where people can assemble to do their things are all connected, and they're all essentially different versions of the same thing. A safe and accessible place where people can just go and be. And that is particularly valuable for young people, as so evidently shown in the work that you do here. You know, young people get a raw deal, officially.
Well, we agree. And I think we'll come on to that in some more detail in a little bit. But I think it'd be good as well to start by giving a sense for people who've never been to a youth club. I suppose in some part of the popular imagination, some people might just think of them as a building with a ping pong table. And I think that is a kind of characterization that you strongly dispute. But at the broadest level, what actually is a youth club? And why do you think they've mattered so much in Britain?
So what is a youth club? My definition is very broad. It's a warm and welcoming space where people roughly in the second decade of life can come to do the things they're interested in or to find out what they're interested in, usually with a kind of supportive adult in the picture who will make these things possible. And actually it's a remarkably stable entity as well. I found an illustration of a youth institute from 1880 which had like a kind of coffee bar type thing, some people doing some drawing, some people playing some board games, and then this big sign at the back which said hats off. I've seen that something very similar in youth clubs I visited in the last couple of years, where they'll be saying like, you know, no balaclavas or caps off or blah, blah, blah.
Why do you think they've mattered so much?
I think youth clubs matter so much in this country for a couple of reasons. One are the historic levels of wealth inequality that have been present in this country, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, which were broader and deeper and worse than in many other comparable countries, which meant that the need was greater for young people. That was true then, you know, back in the 1880s, which is one of the starting points that you can use when you're looking at the history of the youth club. And it's also true now. So it's been important, particularly just to address a need. Young people have a raw deal and long have had a raw deal in this country. But they're also important because they create environments where, for better or worse, ideas can happen, things can happen, a moment can turn into a movement. I was listening recently to another kind of cultural thinker called Jean-Claude Lionbeat. He has these cargo bikes with speakers on them, and there's a youth work element to what he does as well. And he was describing these cultural spaces, youth clubs and the other rooms in the house, as places where social capital can be generated, which can then turn into cultural capital, which can then turn into economic capital. And the way that I look at it is that the youth club deals in a more profound economy, or you could look at it in this kind of tiered way as Jean-Claude does. But I think they're places that allow things to happen, and we've seen over the histories that I've written that these have turned into cultural movements on multiple occasions, or at the very least, the youth club has contributed to cultural movements in this country in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think we'll get to some of the historical origins. I'm curious to hear from you. Do you think youth clubs are misunderstood by the broader British public, or perhaps by people who haven't used them? Is there a misunderstanding of what they are and what they're for?
I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding about what they are and what they're for, which is partly why I wanted to write this book, because I knew that the things that happen in youth clubs are incredibly valuable. I went to youth club, I've worked on youth projects, and I currently work on a youth project every week. I know they're valuable, I know they're misunderstood. And I just felt a bit outraged. All this incredible work, which is done by people kind of on the edges of society often, with very little resources, incredibly resourcefully, was not better understood, was not valued. And I sometimes think in my more uncharitable moments that there's a willful misunderstanding of it. It's easier not to see the value, because to see the value means reckoning with wealth inequality in this country, means reckoning with long-standing ways in which some parts of our society do far worse than others, and specifically young people.
If there's this broader misconception amongst people in the public about what they are and what they're for, that then presumably would flow through to the kind of political sphere and the extent to which they are, in your view, do you think politically undervalued?
Completely. I mean, it's not just me either. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, who I must be honest, hadn't assumed would be a friend of the youth club, found that the cuts that happened during austerity, which were extreme, caused like £3 worth of cost for every £1 that was quote unquote saved. So it's not just me that thinks this, it's other people too, with far better statistical graphs than me. But I think this also relates to what we were just talking about, which is there is a kind of demographic divide between who generally goes to youth club and who generally doesn't. And I think one of the ways of looking at that is if you pay for private education, often you get things like access to sport or culture. Maybe there's a theatre, maybe there's like a music room with musical instruments in it. And actually the youth club offers many of the same things. Your guitars might be a bit more broken up. Your sports area might be a little bit more dusty. But in a way, I've sort of noticed a similarity between what is available to those who grow up in families where parents pay for education and leisure, and what happens in the youth club, which is broadly used more frequently by those who have less economic cushioning. It is worth saying also that youth clubs are for everybody. And young people who have parents with economic cushioning also need to associate with each other. They need to get out of their bedrooms and, into physical space. So I was speaking to a youth worker just last week about so many young people spending so much time on their devices. And he said to me, some young people are chronically online, but once they've been into a youth space and they've been encouraged to find out what they're interested in and they're welcomed and accepted, they can't be chronically online in the same way. And I think what he meant by that was something changes in you as a person when you're welcomed into a space, when you realise that you can connect, and when you meet adults who treat you with mutual respect. It changes something.
That's fascinating. I think it's worth at least discussing some of the historical origins of youth clubs, because that's a big part of what the book is about. And I think one of the surprising things, at least for me, when reading it, was that there were quite complicated origins for many of these things. So some began as more religious or philanthropic projects, sometimes quite paternalistic in many ways, often set up by churches, public schools, wealthy patrons. But over time, many became more democratic, more creative and more youth-led spaces, So I suppose, in broad terms, how should we understand that historical evolution of the youth club?
Well, as you say, it's a complicated family tree. But the family tree has some distinct branches. And some of those are churches and Sunday schools, which offered a kind of like youth club-esque environment. And one part of the family tree is also during the Industrial Revolution. Women who had more wealth and more time made it their business to try and do something for the girls and young women who were working in factories. So they would set up rest and recreation rooms for the girls. And then that became a youth club. And actually that's the direct antecedent of the National Association of Youth Clubs, which is now called UK Youth. So that's literally where it began. And then you have boys' clubs, and that similar kind of impulse of people saying, oh, well, we need to do something for these young people who are working so hard in these terrible conditions. But then you also have young people organising things for themselves, and sometimes just needing to find adults who will make the space for them. A sort of singular part of the family tree are most establishment universities and public schools, who again around 1880 decided to start going out into often East London, sometimes South London, to start up mission houses or settlement houses, where they would go and live with the poor and dispense their kind of like wisdoms and so on to help the poor. And so many of these buildings still exist. Oxford House, for example, in Bethnal Green. There are settlement houses and mission houses still everywhere. And there's one account of a youth club at the Eton Mission, which is hilarious because they talk about dances that were so lively that they had to kind of keep like drunken adult men out. And they talk about the young people basically like wrecking the joint, you know, like throwing things around, blasting out the gas pipes, throwing bagatelle balls around. And, you know, really destroying the place, kind of, you know, in some ways you might think vandalising it. But perhaps this was familiar to the Etonians because of, you know, they had something called the Bullingdon Club. Again, not too dissimilar. And there's an account of the adults coming up with this idea to deal with this raucousness of what they called night runs. And so taking the young people from Hackney out on a run, maybe sometimes as far as Epping Forest, just to basically wear them out. And then they found that that was a very effective way of dealing with over-exuberance in the youth club. So the history is patchwork. The history of the provision also is patchwork, and the history of the funding is also patchwork. It's always come from lots of different places.
It's fascinating. What was the most surprising to you when you were researching the early history? Was there anything you came across that you didn't previously know and were surprised or shocked by?
Well, if we sort of fast forward to the 70s, which I think is the most recognisable starting point of the youth club as most people will have it in their imagination, you know, the ping pong table or the place with the PlayStation. If we kind of go back to there, then there were many surprising things for me. One was something which I sort of half knew but hadn't fully realised, which is the relationship between youth clubs and sound system culture. So Black British people bringing with them like music and culture, often from the Caribbean, and, you know, arriving in Britain. And those second generation people often wanting to put on events for themselves, and also because they weren't welcome in white spaces either, because of the colour bars which still existed at that time and the generalised extreme racism that was present. And when I realised how often youth club spaces were used in a sound system situation, I suddenly understood more about why youth clubs are so powerful, because they also contain all of that diasporic energy, all of the energy that comes from people who are British and from afar, and all those differences that are brought into the mix, and the need that was evident in those spaces as well, and how those spaces catered to need in a very powerful way.
When you look over the more recent decades, so fast forwarding from the 70s onwards, there seems to be somewhat of a trope in, you could call it, in the media discourse or in public debate more broadly. The discussion about youth clubs often emerges at times when there's heightened anxiety about younger people, whether to do with crime, sexuality, political unrest. And it seems, if you look at it through that prism, that youth clubs, at least in the public consciousness, have sometimes been caught between two different kind of competing ideas. One idea, probably the truer one, is an attempt to try and support younger people, and another is the attempt to control them. And so I suppose it'd be interesting to get your reflections on whether you think over more recent decades there has been a tension between the desire to support and the desire to control younger people?
Well, I think it's a perennial power struggle. If you think about the way youth clubs are spoken about over more recent decades, it's often in terms of youth violence. And I think it's racist and classist to be assuming that youth work relates to those things. Actually, child poverty is extremely violent. These are the things that we should be looking at, not blaming the people, young people that are growing up in a society in which things are made much more difficult than they could be or should be. So my observation is that the structures which bear down on the youth club in terms of policy often are, whether they are explicit about it or not, are about control. They're about making sure that young people aren't a problem. However, on the ground, the youth worker is the entity that I think sits between these two power dynamics. And the youth worker, I think, mediates and modulates and moderates that structural power. You'll often find in youth projects, they're supposed to be doing X, Y, Z in terms of their funding or in terms of what they're supposed to be for. But actually, on the ground, in reality, what happens is young people are welcomed into a space, made to feel like they can just be whoever they are, however they are. And that in itself is potentially transformative.
Do you think that approach, basically viewing youth clubs as solely anti-crime service provision, can you see a kind of practical flow-through effect of thinking of these things in quite a narrow, paternalistic way to how that actually then translates into the types of services that are delivered?
I think it makes it much more difficult for those who do the work. I've met and seen and read about in the archives some just incredibly resourceful youth workers who make the spaces work even when policy and funding and those sort of structural pressures make it much more difficult to do what actually is required. But also, I think we fetishise youth and we often extract from youth culture, trends, ways of being, new ideas, whilst not liking actual young people very much. What about actually focusing on the young people? So this is what I mean about a fetishisation of youth without actually engaging in relationships of mutual respect with young people.
Absolutely. I agree with that. But you did mention there the kind of structural pressures on youth services and youth clubs. So I think it would be good to talk a little bit about the story under austerity and what happened there. So I think that seems to be a pretty significant turning point in the recent history of youth clubs. And after 2010, local authorities across the country came under huge funding pressures. Youth services were typically treated as non-essential compared to other responsibilities, and many closed or lost funding. But what actually happened? What did it look like on the ground across the country for youth clubs during the period of austerity?
So I've learnt about this retrospectively. I was working on a youth project at that time, but it was funded in a different way. What I understand now is that local authority youth provision suffered the worst of it. There was a 70% cut in youth services up to about $1 billion. Just for a little bit of context, you know, we think about libraries as having been decimated. And I heard from someone at DCMS that libraries only had their overall funding cut by 50%. But the young people came off absolutely the worst during austerity. So when I was researching the book, I found something that I found quite staggering, which was that between 2014 and 2019, local authorities sold off 12,000 of our buildings, public buildings that were previously owned by us, available for us to use, not just youth clubs, but community centres, for example. They sold off 12,000 of these buildings, often just to pay for the redundancy costs of people who were losing their jobs because of austerity. So it's not like they even went into the bank account to be used for something else. It was to pay for the losses of austerity and the costs of austerity to us on the ground. And I just think that more than anything else speaks to the deep damage that all of that did to us on a neighbourhood level, not having that youth club, that community centre, that village hall to go to anymore, and we're still paying.
And I think that's the interesting part of the story. It's not just the physical infrastructure that was lost, but it's the human capital. It's all that knowledge, the local contextual knowledge of youth workers been in established communities for a very long time that was lost over that period. Why do you think it was youth services in particular that came in for pretty significant cuts during austerity, it often seems that younger people are on the receiving end of bearing the brunt of those tough choices. The triple lock on the state pension is a separate conversation. That was introduced in 2011. At the same time, many of these youth services were being gutted.
Yep. I mean, also, before I answer that, I'm just thinking about, who benefited from austerity? Well, the wholesale transfer of public assets into the private sector was the outcome of austerity, wasn't it? And we're continuing to pay the price for that. Many of the costs were socialised. And so the cuts aren't just what we lost at the time. It's the costs which we are still paying, which young people are still paying for, all that private profit which was transferred to the bank accounts of pretty much individuals at a time when millions of young people have now lost the benefit of having attended youth club. The Institute of Fiscal Studies also found the costs of the youth club closures weren't mitigated by proximity to libraries or parks. It is specifically youth clubs. Why were they so vulnerable? Well, there's the thing about people with political power maybe not having been to youth club, maybe not understanding it on a felt level. There's the way in which the value and history of youth clubs is kind of invisibilised, not obvious. There is a weak statutory responsibility for local authorities. They do have a statutory responsibility to provide youth services in some shape or form, but there's no statutory responsibility to pay for it. And there have been multiple moments, when you read back through Hansard, multiple moments where people have worked really hard to try and get that corrected, and they've always failed because the government probably judged it would be too expensive.
Were some places hit harder than others across the country?
Well, I think there's also a cultural thing there where it's the degree to which a local authority holds an institutional memory of the value of these things. So, for example, in Tower Hamlets, which historically has had excellent youth provision, and you could argue, as I do in my book, that the youth provision in Tower Hamlets is what basically created the genre of grime, a kind of globally famous genre of music that generated massive social, cultural and economic benefit because of a remaining network of youth clubs. And if you read Tower Hamlets' youth strategy, which came out a few months ago, it's like it could have come from the post-Albemarle era in the 1960s, where huge sums of money were being unleashed to build, hundreds of youth clubs around the country. They've opened 20 youth clubs in the borough. They now have a very, very strong, thriving, healthy youth provision because they determined that it was valuable and they've invested in it.
I suppose touching on the more contemporary things, I think that Tower Hamlets example is a really interesting one. I think it's pretty obvious to say that the kind of world that younger people now are growing up in looks obviously very different from the one that previous generations grew up in. More time online, on devices, on social media, more anxiety, a huge kind of mental health crisis amongst younger people, and then also really bigger structural pressures on them in terms of people facing really high housing costs, families having financial insecurity and financial stresses, and also just the kind of reduction in spaces where younger people can spend time together that don't cost money, and public spaces. So I suppose, how has the need for youth clubs changed compared to the past?
The youth club is a very responsive entity, and it has been historically, and it is so now. So I'm thinking, for example, about a project in the northeast called the Warren. And one of the things that it does is it works for young men who are at risk of radicalisation from the far right. So that's probably, that's one of the things that they do, and they do that very successfully. But probably if you were to go there on a Friday night, it would just be a laugh. There are also some people doing some really interesting work with online youth work as well. And I would say at this point that I think it's a false binary to talk about physical space and the online world. Both exist. One is very well catered for, often very entangled with far right online, and one is very poorly catered for and often entangled with really incredibly positive outcomes. I honestly believe that the youth club is a solution to so many social problems.
Was the loss of youth clubs as a result of austerity a betrayal of young people in the UK?
I think it absolutely was. But more broadly, I think it was a betrayal of all of us. Because what happens to young people is a question for all of us. Because if things go well for our young people, they go well for those of us who are not young. If they don't go well for young people, they don't go well for the rest of us either. And so the betrayal, I think, was wholesale across almost every sector of society, with young people picking up a particularly brutal amount of damage.
Looking forward, the government has made some moves in a direction of, they've just released a new national youth strategy, and there also seems to be, although the details are still somewhat unclear to me at least, funding for things they're calling youth futures hubs. But the sector, especially compared to provision in the past, still seems somewhat fragmented, pretty underfunded, and service provision can be very uneven across the country.
Yes.
So I suppose, given that, how would you, to the best of your knowledge, rate the kind of government's current approach in this policy space? Do you think the government is conscious of the extent to which the types of youth clubs might have to be different now, given the different challenges younger people are facing?
Youth clubs need to respond to what young people want and need, absolutely. I think for me it's interesting that the comparable moment in the youth club history is 1960, after the Albemarle report, where over 300 youth clubs were built around the country with new money. And this National Youth Strategy, has promised up to 50 young futures hubs. But for me, up to does a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Will there really be 50? And actually 50 across the whole country isn't enough either. We need locality youth clubs. We need youth workers to be paid, because again, in the National Youth Strategy, there's quite a lot of money for capital projects. But who's going to open the doors? Who's going to close the doors? Who's going to clear up the ping pong bats or put away the PlayStation or have a little chat with so-and-so who needs to have a little chat? But on the other hand, this is a really good moment for youth clubs because there's so much energy and positivity around the subject. I think they've become a shorthand for signalling that you've got a kind of progressive identity. And anytime there's a good moment for youth clubs, we have to make the most of that moment, and I feel very sure that the resourceful and brilliant youth workers and people who lead these projects out there will make the most of it.
Are you more optimistic now than you were, say, 5 or 10 years ago?
I think you have to be optimistic about the future of youth clubs, and it is, like I say, a rich moment for these environments and for people who work in them. I think when you're thinking about youth clubs, you have to approach it with the mentality of something youthful, which is about being curious. It's about thinking about new things. It's about making the most of what you have. It's about being resourceful. I feel like there's a greater understanding of the value of these spaces. And I also have complete faith that the people who run these spaces will continue to do an amazing job, and that young people who come through these spaces will benefit from being there. And so I am absolutely optimistic.
Given what we've touched on today, both on the thinking about the kind of pressures that younger people are facing across the UK, but also more broadly, how do you see the landscape of intergenerational fairness in the UK?
I think your work articulates that unfairness in a particularly clear way, and I think that's really useful in the mix. But I think something interesting has happened over the last maybe 10, 15 years, which is that if you imagine a kind of like your sort of typical white English kid in a white English family, the dynamic between older and younger is kind of traditionally quite combative, kind of what you might call aggy. Now, I think that many white English young people now go to school with or are friends with young people from different backgrounds, where there is a different relationship to elders or older people or family, or questions of respect, or the questions of how you are with other family members. And I think that's another kind of hidden benefit of the massive, gorgeous diversity we have in this country. And obviously, we have that diversity for what might politely be called reasons. What I think that's done is I think that's shifted in younger people ideas about intergenerationality. So you will have, I think, more broadly, more people in their kind of like mid-20s to younger who are more interested in intergenerationality in the sense of being around older people. For example, there's a party in Bristol where they've just offered like free entry to your over 60s. You know, if you've got someone, an older person in your family who wants to come to our party, they're welcome. So, and often I find myself when I'm speaking about my work, often it will be younger people who will say to me, what about intergenerational spaces? So I think there's a cultural shift happening where young people are more open to maybe addressing this unfairness by building relationships and alliances with older people. So I think even though you're talking about intergenerationality in terms of wealth disparities or opportunity disparities. I think there's a value in intergenerationality in terms of people getting to know each other better and valuing each other, and a kind of culture of mutual respect between the young, the not yet old, and the not so young.
And there's obviously in those kinds of spaces huge amounts that both parties can learn from each other.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And I think, part of our work is to try and obviously do the kind of numbers, work out the data and the kind of these slightly more technical questions. But it's also about, I think, making sure that it's not about pitting generations against each other.
Absolutely.
It's trying to make sure that there's evidence out there that shows where there are these trade-offs. And often a good route to that is to try and appeal to grandparents and say, think about your grandkids. I think bringing it down to that level of thinking about those intergenerational relationships within families can sometimes be a good way to try and help sometimes older generations understand why they ought to care about these pressures affecting younger people.
Absolutely.
If you were advising a government that wanted to do something about these challenges and reduce inequality and improve fairness, what are one or two reforms that you think the UK ought to prioritise in the next few years?
I think the really fundamental thing is train, pay for youth workers, because they are the essential part of it. A youth worker can run a youth club almost anywhere, almost literally anywhere. And without them, the youth club cannot exist. So you need the trained people to do the work. And then you also need the physical space. That's where the magic happens.
Do you have a sense of what the kind of increase in that particular type of funding ought to look like? I mean, the UK spends, I think it's around £1.3 trillion a year on different things, and youth services, youth provision would occupy the most minuscule slice of that.
I'm just thinking about the stats in the National Youth Strategy, which was 600 million for HAF, which is the half-term food bank type thing. And I think it was 15 million for youth worker training. So there was definitely a big disparity between money for capital projects and money for youth worker training. Someone pointed out that, the cost of keeping a single young person in care is something like, it's over £300,000 a year, which obviously would fund probably a whole youth club with many hundreds of young people coming through it. And it also occurs to me that in Wales, care has to happen in a not-for-profit scenario. So why are our care homes, why do we have individuals taking private profit out of our care homes when actually that money could be so easily spent somewhere else? So I think, if anyone wanted to deal with it, of course they could. There'd be tweaks they'd be able to make to pay for it. But the political will needs to be there. And I hope that the stories of the youth club help support people with structural power to make better decisions on these matters.
I think that's a really good place to end. Thank you so much for your time today, Emma. I think this is such an important and often overlooked story and space in this country. So
it's a great British story.
It is.
It really is.
Yeah, it is. And I think the points you made, particularly thinking about these spaces beyond just the physical space, really centering the importance and the kind of amazing work that youth workers do, how important they are. And in many ways, that was the biggest tragedy, I think, of the austerity story, was the loss of that kind of connection to community. So I think there's a few things to be optimistic about in there.
Always.
And also I think as well, situating the youth club in that, as you said, in that kind of, I suppose, like a patchwork or in a house of other different spaces where younger people exist and become themselves.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for your time. If you've enjoyed today's episode of the podcast, you can find more episodes on our podcast feed or on any of the apps you listen to podcasts on. And you can find us online at if.org.uk and on Instagram at Intergenerational Foundation.